I've been working on this dollhouse kit inside a real goose egg, so today I'm making minis for the inside, including this tile tabletop and tiny egg. I used egg cartons to make the faux stone floors, now I'm using real cement to make tiles for the tabletop. I've modified this kit, so I'm cutting the sharp part off of this laser cut tabletop. I'm attaching some cardstock using double-sided flooring tape. The cardstock is adding a bit of overhang to the tabletop so I can fit more tiles. The table is flat across the front and curved along the back to fit on the inside of the eggshell. I'm using a cement product called Henry Feather Finish to make the tiles. I'm donning my dust mask and adding some of the cement to a plastic container I got recently with some takeout. This product is meant for skim coating and filling imperfections before a flooring installation. It's very easy to work with and forgiving. You can mix it to a really watery consistency that spreads nicely or keep it on the thicker side. This is pretty much the consistency of smooth peanut butter, so I'm ready to make my tiles. I found this silicone honeycomb textured pot holder at a Goodwill by the pound outlet. Being a miniaturist, I immediately thought of a way I could use it in miniatures as a mold for tiles. I'm trying to make sure each of the cavities is completely filled by making multiple passes from different directions. Feather finish will stick to vinyl, wood, and almost any surface, but it won't stick to silicone. The concrete dried in about 10 minutes and easily pops out of the silicone pot holder. For a different look, you could use tinted resin or clear resin to make glass tiles. This would be the perfect thickness for 1/12 scale, but for my 1/48 scale project, I sanded the tiles to make them much thinner and more in scale. I wore a mask throughout this dusty process and used a damp paper towel to remove the dust from the front and back of each tile. It only took a couple passes on the sandpaper to get the cement to the desired thinness. Even after sanding, the cement is still quite strong. I'm applying my first tile by lining up one of the straight hexagonal edges along the edge of the tabletop. I'm applying them in a honeycomb pattern, mimicking the pattern on the pot holder. The double-sided flooring tape is very sticky and easily holds the tiles. I applied the tiles, leaving overhang, and used a craft knife to cut the excess. Instead of making passes with the blade like you're cutting wood, just press the blade straight down to trim the excess. You could keep this industrial look, but I'm going for some color, so I tested 3 different colors of nail polish. The green and pink looked a bit too unnatural for me, so I went with this mauve-y pink. I'll be adding grout, so I'm making sure to avoid the grout lines by tapping the nail polish brush on each of the tiles. If you try to apply the nail polish in a pulling motion like you would on your own fingernail, you may fill the gap in between the tiles. When you first pull the brush out of the bottle, there's too much polish on the brush, so I tap it on multiple tiles to distribute the polish, and then I tap each tile to make sure they get full coverage. With just one coat, there was a gray undertone from the cement, so I added a second coat. I'm not sure if it made a difference, but I covered each tile with a clear sealer to make them look even more like ceramic or porcelain. As a finishing touch, I added a couple layers of nail polish along the front, sides, and underside. The sealer has dried, so I'm grouting my tiles with some spackle. I'm using my finger to apply the spackle so I can smush it in between each of the tiles to make sure there are no dark gaps. I'm pressing firmly and wiping to fill all the spaces and to make cleanup a bit easier by having less spackle on the surface of the tiles. If you don't have spackle, you could also use plaster of Paris. I am absolutely loving how this is looking and imagine myself doing this for a 1/12 scale bathroom floor or kitchen backsplash. Now that the tabletop is ready, I need to spruce up these cheap mass-produced plastic chairs. I sanded the plastic chairs and stuck them to double-sided tape to begin the transformation. The chairs are seriously lacking dimension, so I'm completely coating them with wood glue. When the wood glue dries, it'll retain this domed appearance. This will disguise the plastic origins and make each of the pieces look less perfect, so they look more like carved wood and less like printed plastic. The wood glue has dried, but before I add paint, I'm adding more detail using these metal nail decor beads I got from Temu. I used a tiny dab of UV resin to add a no-hole bead to the top of each of the chairs. You could also use super glue, but I was out at the time. I had completely forgotten I thickened this Palladian blue house paint with baking soda, so imagine my surprise when the toothpick broke. I added a touch of water and dabbed the color onto each chair. You could stop here, but you know I never would. My Goose Egg Dollhouse is owned by a beekeeper, so I'm adding some age and character using some antique wax from Waverly. I added the wax a section at a time and wiped away the excess before it could dry. The chair on the left has been subdued with the wax. I traced the seat onto some cardstock and glued 2 layers. I'm using this paper piece to make a cushion for each of the chairs. I cut this bit of fabric, making sure the flower was centered in the middle. I trimmed the excess fabric, leaving just enough overhang to wrap around the sides and barely overlap the bottom. First, I'm adding the hot glue to the very edge and immediately pressing the fabric into it. Some excess squeezes underneath the piece of fabric, so I fold it over the bottom. You could stop here, but I just can't. I'm creating another adorable detail by adding a bow to the back of each chair. I made a big sewing thread bow, pulled the tails until the loops were tiny, and secured it using glue. The tails were sticking straight out, so I glued them down and held them with Dollar Tree clips. I scraped away some of the paint so my seat will stick better. The bows create the impression that the seat covers are tied onto the chairs. I drilled a hole in my paper tabletop to fit a fancy toothpick leg. The design is pretty boxy, so I'm using a cheap file to change the shape. I used a pencil to draw a line of the height of my table leg and one of my files to create a very nice taper. The toothpick was surprisingly strong, and I could see myself using the same technique to make 1/12 scale pegs or clothespins. I could have held it with tweezers, but instead I chased it around with some Waverly antique wax. Before allowing it to dry, I removed the excess wax with a paper towel. Most of the table will be glued to the inside of the egg, so there's only one leg. I attached it with some wood glue. I previously painted this 3D printed bread pan, and now I'm filling it with bread. I'm lining the pan with these vintage end papers, which apparently have something to do with curling your hair. You can substitute any thin paper like tissue paper. I'm mimicking the look of parchment paper both for added realism and to break up the perfect lines of the 3D printed plastic pan. The large rectangle wasn't giving me the look I wanted, so I cut 4 small rectangles and draped them over each corner using some glue. Adding texture like this is such a simple trick, but it really makes a big impact. I'm sealing the paper with some matte Mod Podge to give it that slight parchment paper sheen and to protect it. I'm making the bread with some air dry clay since I can't put this plastic pan in the oven. I used white glue to help the air dry clay stick and didn't crush all of the texture and gaps out of the clay. I'm using paint and a tiny brush to hint at the look of blueberries. Blueberries tend to look purple as they cook, so I'm adding a little bit of purple in addition to the light blue. Now that I've stained the dough of the bread, I'm adding some nail decor caviar beads to look like blueberries. I'm creating a small cavity for the glue and caviar beads by poking each of my painted spots with a sewing needle. You can hardly see these little beads, so if all you have is paint, don't despair. Bread often cracks as it bakes, so I'm removing a bit of the clay from the top and painting in some more blueberries. The color of this paper clay is making this look like raw dough, so I'm adding some watered down yellow ochre paint to make it look baked. I added the light brownish beige color to the entire loaf, and now I'm touching all the high points with a darker brown to make these areas look golden. For the finishing touch, I'm shaving some white chalk pastel and adding diamond glaze. Pastels are just powdered paint pigments, so if you don't have any, you can use white paint instead. If you don't have diamond glaze, you could use white paint mixed with Elmer's glue. My chalk pastel to diamond glaze ratio was a bit off, so I shaved some more chalk pastel and used a small brush to add streaks of glaze to the top of the bread. This is damn cute and was super easy to make. This pretty little loaf inspired me to try my hand at making some eggs. I'm creating the look of a cracked eggshell by adding some white polymer clay to the end of a Dollar Tree ball stylus and cutting away the excess. This thin amount of clay only takes a few seconds to cure with a heat gun. My heat gun has since died, so this is hard for me to watch. I used a small amount of clay to make this thin, strong shell. To make it look like my eggshells are sitting in a pool of egg white, I'm adding them to a bit of UV resin. I'm using this acrylic stamp pad I got at the Dollar Tree because it's clear, so it'll be easy to cure the resin from below. I made some egg yolks using flattened balls of yellow clay and baked them on my blade with my heat gun. I'm making sure the eggshells and the yolk are in the perfect position before I cure the UV resin. UV resin is toxic until it's cured, so I also cured the resin on my tools. This already looks damn near perfect, but I'm adding a tiny bit of sheen using some Mod Podge. This egg came together so quickly and requires no sculpting skills. Now I need to make a mixing bowl, so I'm using this 3D printed piece from a Robin Betterly kit. I'm adding some more air dry clay using some white glue to the inside of the bowl. To make it look like a spoon was in here scraping this dough into a pan, I'm removing a lot of it using my ball stylus. I'm adding some tiny specks of blue paint to look like there are some burst blueberries in my bowl. I'm adding a coat of matte Mod Podge so my caviar bead blueberries stick. I didn't add any brownish tones because raw batter is generally pretty pale. I'm making a spoon for the bowl using a disposable aluminum baking pan. Using the small end of the ball stylus, I created an indent, flipped it over, and outlined the original indent. One side is rounded outward and it's hollow on the other side. To make it a bit stronger, I'm filling the hollow part with some wood glue. Wood glue dries nice and hard, so it'll protect this flimsy piece of metal from bending. Before the wood glue had time to dry, I cut out the handle and straightened it back out. I'm making the handle and the round portion of the spoon separately to preserve my sanity. I used the large end of the ball stylus to make the end of the spoon and used my 1/8 inch hole punch to cut it out. To make the two pieces look like one, I glued them near each other and added a bit of batter inside of the spoon to make it look used. I was planning to add some of my cracked eggshells to the bowl, but they're a bit out of scale. For 1/48 scale, it really wouldn't be practical to make eggs any smaller than I already did, but the eggs I've been making are actually much better suited for 1/12 scale. I'm using that perfect egg I made in some other project, so for now I made 2 more eggshells and attached them with some UV resin. I am planning out an in-progress scene or prep board using some paper. Once I figure out the appropriate size, I'm using this scrap of vintage thin flooring as my cutting board. I've never found this product anywhere, so I think it's actually just bits of thin veneer. I used the paper template as a guide to cut it to size. I want it to look like there's some flowers sprinkled all over the board, so I'm masking off a section with a piece of painter's tape. I cut out this piece of painter's tape using a hole punch. The white I dry brushed around it looks like flour. To complete the illusion, I'm adding some white glue and sprinkling some white chalk pastels over the surface. I'm hoping it looks like someone was sifting flour into the bowl and some of it got on the cutting board. If you don't have chalk pastels, you could use cornstarch. I'm using diamond glaze to attach my eggshells. There's no egg yolk on the board because the egg yolk is inside of the batter. I'm using some 10-count tapestry canvas to make a basket for the floor. I coated the canvas in white glue and clipped it to a handle to allow it to dry with a curved shape. A colored pencil was slightly too big, which is why I chose this handle. The shape doesn't look very organic, so I'm cutting a tiny bit off of each corner to make them more rounded. To make the handle, I pulled one of the threads out of the tapestry canvas. I cut it into 3 equal pieces and coated each strand with glue. Braiding the pieces can be a bit tricky, so I held the ends with a clip and pinned it down with a 1-2-3 block, which weighs 1 pound. I'm mimicking the look of a basket handle by tightly braiding the cord. Off camera, I added another layer of glue and wrapped it around a colored pencil to dry. Drying in this circular shape helps give me a nice small arched handle. I glued the handle on the inside of the basket. This basket would look really cute filled with a fringed blanket, but I've had this vintage miniature flower kit for some time. I read the instructions and referred to the sample flower and came up with my own method of assembly. I'm arranging some of the flowers on painter's tape, but first I reduced the stickiness by sticking the tape to my clothing. I'm storing all the excess flowers in this glass jar from the Dollar Tree. I'm adding black to the center of each flower, but instead of creating a perfect circle, I'm making a shaggy type of circle. These lines and pointed ends will be visible beyond the center dot. I dotted each of the centers with a cheap white gel pen from Temu. I added a layer of color with a Sharpie, but I preferred the vibrance of the white, so I fixed it. For my first attempt at shaping, I pressed the flower into some watered down white glue with a ball stylus on a foam pad. The center dot completely disappeared and the marker became blurry. I changed tactic and instead sealed all of my flowers using some matte Mod Podge. This protects the paper and the colors I added and adds some stiffness for shaping. I'm removing a paper flower with my X-Acto knife and pressing it into my foam pad using my Dollar Tree ball stylus. You can press it into your hand instead if you don't have a foam pad. In this needle tip bottle, I have some Beacon 3-in-1 glue, which is an acetone glue that's very similar to Fabri-Tac. I'm filling the basket with some forest moss to make it look like stems of flowers. I slightly overfilled the basket, so I'm trimming it so it looks less chaotic. Now it's a simple matter of gluing my flowers to the moss. I made more flowers than I need, so I can use them again quickly in another project without having to assemble them. Baskets come in all shapes and sizes, so I think this would work in larger scales as well. I'm making a rug to add some color and softness to the faux stone floor. I chose this fabric because it frays nicely, so I'm tracing a slightly smaller oval onto some medical tape. I'm sticking the tape to the underside of the rug to keep the fraying in check. The tape will hold the fibers together anywhere it's in contact. I'm fraying the edges by pulling on the strings. If your fingernails aren't doing the trick, you can also use a sewing needle to separate the threads. Once all the edges are frayed, I trim off any excess. For a subtle and subdued pattern, I'm using watercolors to paint on some florals. I'm painting some very basic 5-petal flower shapes and adding some blobby leaves. I'm establishing a base layer of color and will add a tiny bit more detail on top once I dry it with a hairdryer. I used my gel pen to add the center dot to each of the flowers. I'm adding a tiny tinge of yellow to each of the dots with some watercolor paint. I don't want to add much darkness, but I am adding a tiny bit of definition to each of the petals with a little bit of a slightly darker shade of pink. This is sort of an impressionistic style of painting where your brain fills in some details that don't exist. One of the simplest things to make in any scale is a tiny vase of flowers using a bead. I chose this round wooden bead. I'm using some green flocking and a bit of this purple flower I got from a full-size faux flower arrangement. I am harvesting some of the purple styrofoam balls. Rather than sprinkling flocking onto glue, I prefer to mix the two because it creates a lot of dimension and doesn't come off once it dries. I added some additional glue for security and plopped my flocking pile on top. I tried sprinkling the styrofoam balls on the wet flocking, but it didn't work very well, so I decided to roll it around instead. I covered most of the flocking this way, but then for more precise placement, I added little tiny dots of glue and small styrofoam balls in select places. Sticking my stylus in the bead hole was an easier way to manage this tiny bead rather than using tweezers. I have a nice collection of tiny bells and would like to make a dinner bell for the egg house. I was planning to use this bracket, but it's way too big for this project. This tiny broken piece of wire wicker furniture is a much better scale. This will look pretty cute hanging outside of the egg house, but it needs some modifications first. I'm sanding the bit of metal so I can create a larger surface area for gluing. I'm using a bit of cardstock to act as a metal bracket. You can use super glue, but I like to avoid it, so I'm just using white glue. To unify these pieces and help the paint stick, I'm coating them with Ultra Matte from Duraclear. This is the same product I used to coat glass so rub and buff would stick. It creates a slight texture on the surface that helps paint grab. To mimic the look of iron, I painted the bracket black and used antique gold rub and buff on the bell. The brass bell looked a bit too vibrant, so the rub and buff tones it down nicely. I'm adding a tiny bit of black around the rim for the slightest hint of patina. To make this painted bracket look more like wrought iron, I'm starting with a coat of matte sealer. Once that dries, I'm adding a coat of watered down white paint. I dab away the excess and let it dry, and I'm left with this dusty black tone. The white paint pigments got caught in the minimal texture of the matte sealer. Try this technique on some fireplace tools or a miniature fence to make them look like wrought iron. I've come up with an innovative way to add color to the frames of this spring-themed art kit from Robin Betterly. For some of the frames, I'm adding color with a marker to simulate wood stain. These two oval pieces make up one stacked frame, so I'm painting both of the pieces gold. Before I began painting, I paid attention to which art piece correlates with each frame so I can make a plan for coloring and understand which frames end up stacked in 2 layers. I colored these two pieces separately so the glue wouldn't repel any stain or marker I used. Layering the two pieces creates a lot of dimension and makes this look more like carved wood. For the rest of the pieces, I assembled them and then attached them to a popsicle stick to prepare for paint. I painted each of the frames white, painting from multiple directions to make sure I didn't miss any of the wood. I had a limited range of colors and didn't feel like mixing paint, so I decided to try layering chalk pastels over the white paint. The color catches in the painted surface and provides a nice light color with an uneven and chalky appearance. This technique lends itself well to a rustic, worn, or shabby chic look. The pieces of art vary in size, so they each coordinate with a specific frame. I matched each of the frames with the art before I decided on colors. To create the look of glass and protect the paper prints, I added a coat of dimensional magic, but you can also use diamond glaze. I avoid using Mod Podge to mimic glass since it dries with visible brush strokes that catch the light. A layer of tape or trash plastic works as well. Consider joining my Patreon as a free member or for $3 a month, and check out this video next to see all the miniatures I made for Bentley House Minis.